There comes a moment in every human connection when silence speaks louder than words and presence becomes more powerful than pursuit. In the dynamic between the super empath and the avoidant, the most devastating transformation does not arrive through conflict, but through stillness, growth, and unspoken clarity. What happens when the one who loved deeply no longer waits to be chosen? What happens when the empath awakens? The avoidance ego is not built upon self-assurance, but upon avoidance itself, a psychological mechanism designed to keep vulnerability at bay. At its core, the avoidant attachment style is not a sign of independence or emotional strength, but a defense mechanism crafted in early life to cope with unmet emotional needs and unprocessed trauma. The ego of such an individual becomes entangled with distance and control because they have learned to equate closeness with pain and exposure with danger. This fragile ego must maintain a facade of self-sufficiency and emotional detachment to survive. It avoids confrontation with its own needs by projecting a persona that does not need anyone, when in truth, it fears intimacy more than it understands it. When this structure is met with a super empath, especially one who has awakened to their inner clarity and emotional awareness, the avoidant's delicate system of control begins to tremble. The empath, by their very nature, has the capacity to feel deeply and connect profoundly. But when that empathy is no longer naive or self-sacrificial, when it is informed by insight and self-worth, it becomes quietly revolutionary. The super empath does not beg, chase, or engage in emotional bargaining. Instead, they observe, they detach, not to hurt, but to preserve their own integrity. And this subtle change in behavior hits the avoidant at the root of their constructed power. The avoidant expects to be pursued. Their ego thrives on the belief that they are the ones being chosen, the ones whose presence must be earned. They hold the key to connection, dangling it just out of reach, believing that the other will jump, reach, or break themselves trying to grasp it. This dynamic gives the avoidant a sense of superiority and dominance, not out of cruelty, but out of the deep, unconscious need to never feel emotionally dependent. It is a false sense of safety. But when the empath no longer plays this game, when they no longer reach out or respond to silent treatments or distance with panic, the avoidant is faced with an unfamiliar scenario. Their emotional detachment no longer yields control. It yields silence in return. This silence is not rejection, it is neutrality. The super empath's withdrawal is not rooted in bitterness, but in the acceptance that chasing someone unwilling to connect is a betrayal of their own spirit. This emotional stillness, so alien to the avoidant, becomes unbearable. The ego, which once relied on intermittent reinforcement and emotional confusion, now stands in an empty room with no reaction, no echo, no feedback. This threatens its very identity. The avoidant begins to feel the absence of power, and worse, the realization that their control was never real to begin with. The empath's refusal to collapse into neediness fractures the core illusion the avoidant ego depends upon. Suddenly, they are not the ones who are withdrawing. They are the ones being left in emotional limbo. Their behaviors no longer trigger guilt or longing in the other. Instead, they are met with peace. And peace, for the avoidant, is terrifying when it comes from someone they expected to manipulate unconsciously, because now they must look inward. They must face the void within themselves that can no longer be distracted by the drama of pursuit or the high of being chased. The ego resists this truth. It wants to reassert dominance. But each time it tries, it finds no audience, only self. The collapse begins there. The super empath possesses a psychological gift that often feels like both a blessing and a burden, the ability to see into others beyond the surface, to feel what is unspoken, and to sense the truth beneath layers of defense. This emotional and intuitive clarity allows the empath to perceive the internal world of others, even when those individuals attempt to conceal, repress, or rationalize their own emotion. For the avoidant, this capacity is deeply unsettling. The avoidant constructs a reality built on emotional distancing, detachment, and intellectual control. They carefully curate how they are perceived, appearing cool, indifferent, and unavailable, not because they are truly unaffected, but because they have spent years hiding their wounds behind a false sense of independence. When the super empath begins to see past these strategies, the avoidant is exposed to a truth they've avoided their entire life, that someone can see the child behind the wall, the fear behind the silence, the need behind the stoicism. This gaze is not loud or confrontational. It is gentle, yet piercing. It reaches places the avoidant has refused to acknowledge even within themselves. The ego, which thrives on projection and suppression, begins to falter under the weight of this unspoken understanding. What is terrifying for the avoidant is not the empath's anger or confrontation. It is the fact that they are being truly seen without having granted permission, and more importantly, without being in control of what is revealed. The avoidant's ego has been shaped by the need to escape vulnerability. To be seen in emotional nakedness is to feel weak, dependent, and unsafe. But the empath's vision bypasses words, explanations, and performance. It touches the avoidant's shadow, the repressed fears, the grief, the longing for connection they've buried under sarcasm, withdrawal, or stoic detachment. This encounter between the empath's insight and the avoidant's hidden self creates internal dissonance. The avoidant is confronted with the reality that someone can love and understand them not because of the image they present, but in spite of it. This dismantles their illusion of invisibility, the idea that they can disappear and avoid pain by simply not engaging. Such deep recognition shakes the foundation of the avoidant's identity. For years they have maintained control by staying unreadable. They rely on emotional ambiguity to maintain power in relationships, sending mixed signals, retreating during intimacy, staying just out of emotional reach. But the super empath is not confused. They are not fooled. They are aware. And awareness, when rooted in quiet compassion rather than accusation, becomes the most powerful force against a defensive ego. It is not a weapon, it is a mirror. And when the avoidant is forced to see themselves through the mirror of an empath's clarity, they can no longer deny their shadow. This silent confrontation causes internal collapse, not because the empath attacked, but because they illuminated. The avoidant, who thought they were safe behind their walls, begins to feel the discomfort of being seen. This is the beginning of ego dissolution. The fragile structure of control begins to fall away as the avoidant feels emotionally naked in front of someone they cannot deceive. Their fear is not of the empath. It is of what the empath's gaze reveals within themselves. The ego, in trying to protect the psyche, now becomes the very structure that prevents healing. And, in the presence of someone who sees both the pain and the potential, that structure begins to fracture. What follows is a psychological unraveling, a desperate attempt to reassert the mask. But the empath no longer responds to the performance. They only respond to truth. Silence, when used by a super empath, is not the same as passive withdrawal or emotional punishment. It is a conscious, powerful act that shifts the entire dynamic between the empath and the avoidant, Typically, the avoidance ego feeds off unpredictability and emotional reactions. Their pattern involves pulling away to create confusion, only to return intermittently, hoping to maintain control through emotional distance and inconsistency. This strategy works when the other person is reactive, when they plead, question, or seek resolution. But when the super empath becomes aware of the game and chooses silence instead of engagement, the avoidance control mechanism collapses. The silence becomes something entirely different. It becomes a mirror. For the avoidant, silence is often a tool of manipulation. They use it to regain power, to punish indirectly, or to avoid vulnerability. But when the empath mirrors that silence, not from fear or hurt, but from inner clarity, the power shifts. The avoidant expects their silence to provoke a reaction. They believe the empath will reach out, demand answers, or try to re-establish the bond. But when the empath does none of these things, when they remain centered and calm, the avoidant is left without an audience. The silence no longer serves their ego. It begins to reflect back the void they carry within themselves. This mirror effect is devastating for the avoidant because it confronts them with their own emptiness. The empath's lack of emotional reactivity removes the fuel the avoidant needs to maintain their ego's superiority. In the stillness, the avoidant begins to sense something deeply unsettling. That their silence, which once created power, now reveals isolation. The emotional distance they once used to dominate the connection now becomes a space that highlights their own disconnection, not just from the empath, but from themselves. The empath's silence is not cold. It is not about withholding love. It is about refusing to engage in patterns that violate their peace. It is a boundary, not a punishment. It is the empath stepping out of the emotional maze and choosing not to participate in dynamics that diminish their worth. The avoidant, who relied on confusion and unpredictability, now faces an energy that cannot be pulled into chaos. They cannot bait the empath with silence because the empath is no longer waiting. This creates an internal panic within the avoidant, an identity crisis of sorts, because their methods no longer work, and their emotional dominance dissolves. Over time, this silence begins to unravel the avoidant's sense of control. The ego, which once believed it could maintain emotional distance while still being desired, starts to question its place. The avoidant wonders why the empath is not chasing, not suffering, not reacting. This lack of reaction forces them to face questions they have long buried. Do I matter? Am I being rejected? Is there something wrong with me? These are questions the avoidant has spent their life avoiding, and now they echo louder in the silence the empath maintains. What makes this silence so destructive to the avoidant's ego is that it removes any illusion of superiority or control. It leaves the avoidant alone with themselves, and in that space, the mask begins to crack. The silence becomes unbearable, not because it hurts them directly, but because it reflects everything they have avoided facing. The empath has not attacked, has not argued, has not chased. They have simply withdrawn into their own peace, leaving the avoidant to confront the very thing they fear most, the absence of connection, the truth of their emotional isolation, and the recognition that the game they once played no longer commands power. Detached compassion is one of the most powerful weapons in the super empath's arsenal, not because it harms, but because it neutralizes. It is the ability to care without clinging, to see someone's pain without absorbing it, and to offer understanding without surrendering one's own boundaries. This type of compassion is deeply unsettling for the avoidant because it strips their ego of the emotional leverage it depends upon. The avoidant's power lies in their unpredictability, the hot and cold behavior, the mixed signals, the withdrawal that keeps the other person emotionally invested and insecure. But the super empath, once awakened, stops responding with emotional dependence. Instead, they offer compassion from a place of emotional detachment, which confuses and disarms the avoidant entirely. When the empath is still unconscious of their own strength, they tend to overextend themselves in relationships. They try to rescue, fix, or heal the avoidant, believing that love means enduring inconsistency and earning closeness through sacrifice. The avoidant, often unknowingly, uses this dynamic to maintain control. They give just enough to keep the empath hooked, then withdraw to create emotional scarcity. This triggers the empath's desire to reconnect, and the cycle continues. But when the super empath becomes aware of this pattern, they stop chasing, they stop needing, they begin to love with open eyes and a closed door to manipulation. Their compassion becomes informed by clarity, not desperation. This shift is devastating to the avoidant's ego because it removes the reward they are used to receiving for their detachment. The empath no longer reacts to withdrawal with panic or confrontation. Instead, they respond with stillness, with understanding, but without emotional collapse. They might acknowledge the avoidant's pain or fear, but they do not abandon themselves in the process. This renders the avoidant's typical defenses useless. Guilt trips, passive-aggressive distance, or emotional withholding no longer yield the desired effect. The super empath remains calm, kind, but unmoved, and that calmness feels like emotional exile to the avoidant, whose ego survives by stirring the emotional waters of others. The avoidant cannot manipulate someone who is no longer emotionally triggered by their absence or silence. The ego, accustomed to control through avoidance, begins to experience confusion and even fear. It doesn't understand how someone can care deeply and yet not be controlled by that caring. The super empath's detached compassion is a paradox to the avoidant. How can someone love and still walk away? How can they feel empathy without being consumed? This contradiction exposes the avoidant to a form of emotional maturity they have never mastered, and it forces them to confront the rigidity of their own coping mechanisms. As the empath stands in their balanced emotional space, they no longer give away their energy just to be accepted. They stop trying to prove their worth. They hold space for the avoidant's struggle without becoming a casualty of it, and this quiet refusal to be manipulated becomes the most devastating truth of all. The avoidant begins to sense that their behavior no longer holds power, that their push and pull tactics do not create longing, but clarity. The ego begins to realize that it is not being protected, it is being bypassed. Detached compassion reveals a deeper truth that the avoidant ego cannot comprehend, that real love does not control, perform, or plead. It simply is. And when the empath embodies that truth without bending to the ego's games, the avoidant is left alone with their own limitations. The ego, which thrives on emotional chaos, finds itself silenced in the face of peace. The game is over, not because it was lost, but because the other players stopped playing. When a super empath begins to grow, spiritually, emotionally, and psychologically, it sends a silent but powerful shockwave through the avoidant's ego. The avoidant, who has maintained a sense of superiority and detachment by staying emotionally distant, begins to realize that the empath is no longer waiting, hurting, or circling the same emotional loop. The empath is evolving, while the avoidant remains stuck in a self-imposed prison of emotional stagnation. This contrast, though never spoken aloud, is deeply threatening to the avoidant's ego, because it brings into the light a truth that can no longer be denied. The empath is healing, and the avoidant is not. The avoidant often operates from a place of hidden insecurity and fear, masked by a cool exterior and a refusal to become vulnerable. Their entire defense system is built around keeping others at arm's length, so they never have to confront the vulnerability that comes with real intimacy. Meanwhile, the super empath may begin the relationship unaware of their own codependent patterns, but over time, pain becomes a teacher. They begin to self-reflect, to turn inward, to understand their own emotional wounds, and more importantly, to take responsibility for their healing. The moment they begin choosing themselves, something monumental shifts. The energy dynamic between them and the avoidant is no longer imbalanced. The super empath stops over-explaining, stops begging to be understood, and stops waiting for emotional breadcrumbs. They start building their own life, pursuing purpose, reconnecting with their identity, and embodying boundaries that once seemed impossible. Their glow changes, their posture shifts, and while they may not announce it, the avoidant sees it. In the avoidance world, emotional evolution is rare because it requires confronting the very pain they've buried. So, when they observe the empath growing into their strength without neediness or resentment, it is a reflection they are not prepared for. The avoidant may have once felt emotionally superior, believing the empath's depth was weakness, but now the same emotional depth has become power, quiet, rooted, and untouchable. This realization causes a rupture within the avoidant's ego. The comparison is inevitable. One is rising while the other remains frozen. The ego does not want to acknowledge this, but the psyche cannot unsee what has been revealed. The empath's presence becomes a reminder, not of rejection, but of everything the avoidant refuses to face within themselves. The empathy, emotional intelligence, and strength that the avoidant once devalued are now attributes that reveal their own shortcomings. The empath isn't punishing them, nor are they seeking revenge. They are simply no longer available to participate in the same dysfunctional exchange. That disinterest is what causes the ego to collapse. The avoidant begins to feel something unfamiliar, irrelevance. Their emotional detachment no longer commands the room. Their inconsistency no longer keeps the empath guessing. They are no longer the center of the empath's emotional world, and that absence of attention cuts deeper than any words ever could. The ego, which once felt inflated by being chased or needed, now feels the void left behind when that need is gone. The empath's growth becomes a kind of unspoken justice, a living mirror that forces the avoidant to reckon with their own inertia. They might attempt to re-engage, to pull the empath back into the dynamic, but it's no longer possible. The empath has stepped into their wholeness, and in doing so, they have unknowingly destroyed the illusion of control the avoidant ego works so hard to protect. The most painful truth for the avoidant is not that they were left behind, it is that they never moved forward. The empath did not seek revenge or closure, they simply chose evolution, and that choice became the loudest silence the avoidant would ever hear. In the quiet unraveling of this dynamic, the super empath does not destroy the avoidant through anger or force. They do it through awareness, through transformation, and most powerfully, through absence. As the empath reclaims their identity, their peace, and their inner power, the avoidant is left to face the one thing they've spent their life avoiding, themselves. No dramatic goodbye, no revenge, no final plea, just the calm dismantling of an illusion the avoidant once mistook for control. And in that space where power games fail and masks fall away, the ego collapses, not because it was defeated, but because it was no longer necessary. The empath moved on, and in doing so, they became the mirror the avoidant could no longer bear to look into.